I'm gonna talk be a little broad-based to begin with, and then bring it to a much finer point as we move along. The one thing I'll tell you right up front is I'm not the smartest guy on the face of the earth. I'm not real original. I do have a pretty good memory for remembering what other people think and come up with, so that comes in handy. The apologetics pyramid is one of the very few things that I think maybe actually is original. We've had some discussion this week, talked a little bit, but we haven't really defined apologetics specifically, and I don't want to get into a lot of it, but I want to go through real quickly how we build an apologetic case, because it's germane to the issue of the resurrection in particular. At the very base of the issue of apologetics is the question of whether God exists at all. Okay, and for someone who comes from an atheistic perspective, that's the first thing that really has to be determined: is there any God? And that is done with typically with scientific and philosophical evidence. I should have given you the definition of what I call apologetics. Apologetics is a branch of theology that seeks to defend the Christian faith against intellectual skepticism. And it does so typically with historical, philosophical, and scientific evidence. So the question of whether God exists is typically answered with scientific or philosophical evidence. But once we decide, okay, there is a God, then which God? Because there's an awful lot of gods out there. There's thousands of gods. In fact, there's some cultures that have 1,000 gods themselves. So how do we determine which God? Well, this is typically answered with historical and philosophical evidence. And I can give you examples of all these. I usually do when I go through this, but I'm really just trying to set kind of a basis. So if you're interested in what some of these other arguments are, we can go over those. But okay, so if we determine then that there is a God, and it's the God of the Bible, then as Christians we believe that God most clearly revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. Well, how do we know that? How do we know about Jesus? And Jesus, the evidence for Jesus is typically proven with historical evidence. At the very tip then is the resurrection itself. It's the primary point of the Christian faith, and it's proven as well with historical evidence. So the neat thing is, though, that you can stand this pyramid on its head, because if the one fact of the resurrection is true, then all the rest of them have to be true as well. So it's kind of the main point. We have that testimony from Scripture as well, and this really answers the question. So why does it matter? In 1 Corinthians 15, and I'll just kind of cherry pick verses 14, 17, and 19 is most specifically germane to what Paul is saying about this. He says, "And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain." Okay, so in that verse he's pretty much saying that we might as well shut up and go home, and what you believe is worthless. In 17 he says, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins." In verse 19, if in Christ we have hope for this life only, we are, of all people, are to be pitied. So Paul definitely thought that the resurrection of Christ is the most important fact in all of human history. Our apologetic mandate from the Bible is 1 Peter 3:15, and I always like to point this out because Peter specifically tells us that we are to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, and yet to do it with gentleness and respect. And that's a key part. I don't want to gloss over that, because that's oftentimes where we can really drop the ball if we come across as arrogant or condescending, or we always want to present this just as we would the gospel, with love and gentleness and respect. But the word defense in this is the Greek word apologia, and that's a legal term that just, again, it means a defense. So Paul definitely thought that the resurrection was important. And so the question of the resurrection, is it a historical fact or a hoax of fiction, is really what we're going to discuss. Now, Louis Marco, in Apologetics for the 21st Century, talks about he calls him a maverick archaeologist, and I won't pronounce this gentleman's name right, but Simcha Jacobovici. Again, I probably slaughtered it, but in 2007, he caused something of a media sensation, and now I'm quoting Marco, by claiming that he discovered the family tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. Jacobovici invited his viewers to consider a crop of stone ossuaries, which are containers which the Jews kept, the Jews of Jesus' day kept the bones of their dead in, bearing the names familiar to the readers of the Gospel. Among them are Mary, Matthew, Jesus, the son of Joseph. Might not the bones in the ossuary labeled Jesus, he asked, belong to the man whom Christians have long believed rose bodily from the dead on that first Easter morning? In the wake of this discovery, several liberal Christian scholars asserted that if the bones in the ossuary could be proven to be those of Jesus, that revelation would not affect their faith in the least. And Marcos, I think, rightly points out, this is something that should make any self-respecting apologist wince. All opinion and rhetoric aside, the simple fact remains that the truth of Christ's claims and of Christianity itself rests firmly and non-negotiably on a literal historical resurrection. Even a cursory reading of the book of Acts will reveal that the central message of the apostles was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, an event to which they were eyewitnesses. There's more than 5 apostolic sermons in Acts alone that testify to Christ's resurrection. So the resurrection is not a doctrine that can be taken or left, or it is the core of Christianity. And he points out also that Christianity, in contrast, is subject to falsifiability. And that's an important point, again, in the broader issue of apologetics and the Christian faith. If you remember, Popper's theory of falsification in regards to science was later adapted by Antony Flew, and it really presented one of the strongest philosophical arguments against theism. Is that his claim was that Christianity, theism, is not falsifiable. But that's not true of Christianity. Christianity is entirely falsifiable because it has such a rooted foundation in historical facts. So, for example, if the bones of Jesus were found and it could be proven they were in that ossuary, it would falsify the Christian faith, because the Christian faith is entirely wrapped up in the resurrection of Christ. Now that's, one specific example, but the belief in Scripture is clearly falsifiable. In the inerrancy of the Bible, if the Bible could be proven to be false, it would undermine that tenet of the Christian faith. Clearly, you can undermine the faith of Judaism, the belief of the Jews in God as well, by falsifying the Old Testament. So there are a number of different ways, and Christianity just happens to be the one faith that is so rooted in the facts of history that it can be falsified. In fact, this is also the Achilles heel of the Muslim faith, of Islam. Because the problem with Islam is entirely, the problem in doing a Islamic apologetic and trying to defend Islam is that its problems are all historic. For example, they claim that Jesus wasn't crucified. Well, they have to deny pretty much all of known scholarship on Jesus to say that that didn't occur. And there's a number of other things, and I'm not here to prove Islam wrong, but just another, arrow in the quiver. If you have to deal with Islam and you're trying to understand how it relates and how to deal with that, you definitely want to do some heavy-duty study in history, because it is the problem. Islam is falsifiable by the facts that are built and grounded in history. Similarly, Christianity is. But the difference is, and I'll just throw this little nugget out for you, Colin Hemmer wrote a pretty in-depth study of the book of Acts, in which he went through an archaeological study, and there are over 80 facts in the book of Acts, times, places, people, and events that are historical facts that clearly show Luke is one of the greatest historians of ancient times. It's absolutely incredible, the level of detail that he went through. Go ahead.
Sorry for interrupting, but if I could just throw in another interesting fact about the book of Acts. The storm that just about sank the ship that Paul was on at one point, and then they were forced to all leave the ship and go to an island. Luke says in his account that they cut their sea anchors at one point, and he had enough detail in the geographic description of where they did that they were actually able to go and find, I think like 2 or 3 years ago, they found these sea anchors exactly where they should have been on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea.
Awesome. Yeah. So again, you know, and numerous times in history, that skeptics have pointed to facts in the Bible and said the New Testament can't be true because this never happened. The funny thing about it is that as our archaeological discoveries have advanced and continued, many of these issues have been resolved, and the interesting thing is that every time they've been resolved in favor of the historical accuracy of the New Testament. So that's a very important, again, broad-based point about apologetics, is that the Christian faith is falsifiable. The ultimate proof of Christianity rests not on emotions or wishful thinking, but on a physical historical event that either did or did not happen. Now, we're going to use what's called a minimal fact approach. That's what I'm going to present to you tonight about the resurrection. And I need to credit Gary Habermas. He's, I believe, one of the world's foremost experts on the historicity of the resurrection. And almost all of my, again, I borrow from anybody that I can that I think is doing a good job. And so most of what I'm presenting to you tonight I've taken from the historical Jesus, ancient evidence for the life of Christ, and specifically the resurrection is dealt with on page 158 through 166. But what we're going to use in this is, and again, this has another broader application, is what's called abductive reasoning. Most of you are familiar with deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and I would hope most of you have at least heard of, and maybe even have some specific experience with abductive reasoning, but it's basically an inference to the best explanation. It deals with the power and scope. So if I have something that I want to try and explain, and I have 5 facts that I know, and I have 3 hypotheses, and one hypothesis explains 2 of these facts, and another different hypothesis explains 3 of these facts, and another one explains all 5 of them, the probability is that the explanation that has the broadest scope and explains 5 of them is probably correct. Now, the other aspect of that is the power. How well does it explain these facts? But that is, to me, the power of a Christian apologetics. There are a number of tremendous arguments for the existence of God, for the life of Christ, for any number of specific points. But the power of the Christian worldview is in its totality of explanatory power. Okay, and this is just an example, okay, of the abduct reasoning for theism, kind of in general. I believe that theism, and in particular the Christian worldview, provides the best explanation for the existence of the universe, the beginning of the universe, the beginning of life and biogenesis, of biology itself, of the order and complexity or design that we find in the universe. I think it's the best explanation of why there's rationality and why facts are discoverable, about abstract entities, why there are numbers, why there are laws of logic, things like that, of consciousness in the universe. I think it's the best explanation for the eternal desire within humanity for their life to have significance and purpose, for the innate sense of the divine, for moral values, and for the enigma of mankind, which is how can we be so great and so horrendous, even sometimes in the same person. Okay? Now, and I always use just the example of Darwinism, okay? Naturalistic evolution. It may have some explanatory power and scope for biology. Now, personally, I don't think its power of explanatory is, its explanatory power is that strong, but other people would vehemently disagree with me. They would claim that it has tremendous power and scope in regards to biology. But what does Darwinism do with moral values? It has virtually no explanatory power for moral values. They may try and concoct something, but again, if we were in that discussion, we'd be able to undermine that very easily. And again, any number of things. So I think that this is an example of how the Christian worldview, the real power of it is its overall, it explains, and there's probably hundreds of others, these are just some that I've kind of cherry-picked, that it explains our understanding of reality overall. It has an answer for everything. And is it perfect? No. Are there challenges to every single one of those in regards to the Christian worldview? Absolutely. But again, if you're thinking of, I like Frank Turek in his book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, uses the example of the top of the puzzle box. Okay? Could you imagine doing a puzzle without the top to the puzzle box? It'd be pretty hard to get it put together, right? Because you wouldn't know what the picture's supposed to look like. Well, I think that if you kind of think about Christianity, the Christian worldview is our puzzle box top. And then you try and put together the facts of reality as we know them, then you get a much better, clearer picture of reality than any other worldview. If you use that as the box top, I think you end up in some trouble. Now, so I wanted to give you kind of this broad base about apologetics, but this is the kind of presentation that the minimalist fact approach uses. Because there are 12, at least 12, facts that most scholars agree on. Most scholars would agree, and when I say most, I mean it's almost universally accepted. You know, not universal, but virtually all, with the exception of number 4, which I'll get to. That Jesus died by crucifixion. Almost all scholars would agree to that. Again, that's where the Islamic worldview would run into trouble, is because they have to disagree with what is known history. And are there some scholars that would disagree with that? Probably. But again, when you look at the totality of historical scholars, you're going to find very few of them, because it is so well documented that Jesus was buried. And again, contrary to what Bart Ehrman says, I think that you'd be very hard pressed to find any number of qualified historical scholars that would disagree with that particular fact. That the death of Jesus caused the disciples great despair. That the tomb was empty, and you'll see that I've asterisked this, because although it's not universal, many scholars do agree with it. And Bart Ehrman thinks that we hang our entire hat on the empty tomb. We don't. I'm not even going to mention it any further, because it isn't as universally accepted a historical fact as some of the others. Number 5 is that the disciples believed that they saw Jesus risen. Again, almost all historical scholars of any credibility would agree that they believed that. Whether they did or not is another question, but that they believed it. 6, this caused the disciples to be transformed. They changed as a result of that belief. That this message was the central teaching of the early church. That it was particularly proclaimed in Jerusalem, where the death took place. Number 9, that this caused the church to be born and grow. That Sunday became the primary day of worship. 11, James, the brother of Jesus, had been a skeptic, but he believed he saw Jesus risen. And a few years later, Paul is converted based on his experience with the risen Jesus. And as most people know, and as, again, historical scholars would all tell you, that Paul was the chief opponent of Christianity. So these facts, again, are very well attested to. They're known history. Now, in regards to number 7, that this message was of the resurrection was the central teaching of the church. To some degree, number 9, and in particular number 10, that the day of worship was changed. J.P. Moreland argues in Lee Strobel's book, A Case for Christ, that based on the fact that the original Christians were all Jews, that only an event like the resurrection could so radically have changed, and he names 5 key pillars to the Jewish religion and the culture that would have been sacrosanct to the 12 disciples that were the initial converts of Christianity because they were Jewish. First of all, that the early church, or early Christians immediately eliminated animal sacrifice. The practice was essential in Judaism, but it was found to be irrelevant and was superseded. It was made obsolete by the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Second, that although Judaism is grounded in the law of Moses, which itself demanded blood sacrifice for atonement, the early Christians shifted from the focus of religion from law to grace. That grace had been released into the world by the power of the resurrection. That their belief in Jesus rose again also caused them to do 2 things that otherwise would have been unthinkable by pious, fiercely monotheistic Jews. They shifted the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, and they proclaimed Jesus as God, worthy of not only imitation, but worship. And the specific citation that he gives for that is Matthew 28:17, which again kind of counters what Bart Ehrman said earlier about only John really identifies Jesus as worthy of worship. Finally, that although the Jews continued to wait for a political Messiah, that's how the Jews viewed the Messiah as political, and the Jews continued to wait for that, for a Messiah that would rescue them from the Roman control. The early Christians adapted themselves to Roman rule and worshiped Christ as a spiritual Messiah. So those are just, kind of a few things that J.P. Moreland would attest to, that again, some of these known facts really highlight that clearly the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, so we've looked at 12, but that's an awful lot to deal with, and there's some debate about that empty tomb thing, and let's just look at 4 minimal facts, okay? And then we're going to do some abduct reasoning. What's the best explanation for these 4 facts that are almost universally accepted by credible historical scholars? That Jesus died by crucifixion. This death is evidenced by the eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, by extra-biblical sources attesting to the crucifixion, including non-Christian sources of Tacitus, Pliny the Younger. Thallus wrote in 52 AD. Okay, now we don't actually have Thallus's writings, but we do have another record of them, and we know that they were written in 52 AD. Trajan, Josephus, and Hadrian, all non-Christian biblical, extra-biblical sources that attest to the crucifixion of Christ. That right there in and of itself is a tremendous, that's why there's no credible historical scholar that is going to deny the historicity of the crucifixion. We have Johann skeleton, which is a 1st century skeleton of a crucifixion victim. So we've learned a tremendous amount about Roman crucifixion from that. Medical testimony of Jesus' post-mortem, which was in, and I think I have that annotated wrong. That wasn't in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was in the JAMA. Strauss's critique of the swoon theory. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Strauss, I'll just kind of, if I can find it here, summarize his critique of that. Or maybe I won't. Here it is, sorry. This is what Strauss says. It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of a sepulchre, which is the tomb, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, could have given the disciples the impression that he was the conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression that lay at the bottom of their future ministry. So that's just kind of a brief summation of David Strauss's, and he wrote that in The Life of Jesus for the People, Volume 1 and 2, edition in page 412. So Strauss's critique of the swoon theory is evidence of it. And there's other New Testament creeds, such as Philippians 2:8 and 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 26. Next fact. The disciples believed they saw a risen Jesus. And again, this is evidenced by eyewitness testimony in the 4 Gospels, the confessional creeds in Acts, early creeds in 1 Corinthians and Luke, extra-biblical sources. Josephus is a non-Christian. The other 3 are Christian, but they're extra-biblical sources. Polycarp, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, and contemporary research on the other early confessions found in the book of Acts really revealed that that quite early on it's evident that the disciples at least believed that they saw the risen Jesus. The corresponding transformation of the disciples. This transformation is evidenced by the testimony of the entire New Testament, the testimony of all the early church fathers that you had kind of referenced earlier as well, and the historical evidence of the disciples dying for their faith as martyrs. 4. The conversion of Paul. This conversion is evidenced by his personal testimony in 1 Corinthians 9:1 and 15:8 through 10, reported 3 times in the book of Acts as cited there, and extra biblical sources again of Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement of Rome. So what explains these 4 facts? Which of the proposed theories provides the best plausible explanation, this abductive reasoning, for these 4 facts? Which provides the greatest explanatory power and scope? The swoon theory, that Jesus wasn't really dead, he just appeared to be. The legend theory, the facts were embellished and turned into legend. The fraud theory, the body was stolen by his disciples. The hallucination theory, that the disciples hallucinated appearances. Or they were disembodied vision theory, appearances were non-physical. Or finally, and I think most credibly, is the resurrection theory, that Jesus did rise from the dead. And I want to just hone in on one minimal fact, okay? I think that this is the most credible evidence for the fact that Jesus did rise from the dead. The transformation of the disciples. Because we have tremendous testimony that before we have Peter's denial in Matthew 26 and John 18, we have clear testimony that they were scattered at his arrest and that they were cowering in the upper room after the crucifixion. After this event, after this proclaimed resurrection, we have the Apostle James was the first of the martyrs of the 12. He was martyred in 44 to 45 AD. And this is the Apostle James. He was the second recorded martyr. He was killed by Herod Agrippa with a sword. The Apostle Peter was martyred about 64 AD. I want to go back because I want to make sure that you know that all of this information is an excerpt from C. Michael Patton's Parchment and Pen blog, except where noted. Now, I also cherry-picked, because he gives, again, this idea of the power of the explanation. He gives a grading of our historical understanding of all these from A to D, and I only picked the things that are A and B. These are very credible historical facts about what happened to the apostles. The Apostle Peter, although just before crucifixion he denied Christ 3 times, after the resurrection he did not do so again. According to Eusebius, he thought himself unworthy to be crucified as his master, and therefore he asked to be crucified with his head downward. The Apostle Andrew, martyred about 70 AD. Andrew, who introduced his brother Peter to Christ, went to join Peter with Christ 6 years later. As Hippolytus tells us, Andrew was hanged on an olive tree at Petrae, a town in Achaia. And I may have pronounced all of those words wrong, you'll have to forgive me. The Apostle Thomas, we all know Doubting Thomas, because of his reluctance to believe the other apostles' witness. But Jesus revealed himself to him, had him put his hand in his wounds. So after this, Christ did appear to him. Thomas believed him to death. Thomas sealed his testimony as he was thrust through with pine spears, tormented with red-hot plates, and burned alive. The Apostle Matthew was martyred about 60 to 70 AD. Matthew, the tax collector, so desperately wanted the Jews to accept Christ, he wrote the gospel. About 10 years before his death, he professed the resurrected Christ unto his death, being beheaded at Nad Devar. James, the brother of Jesus. And James, again, you know, this is a guy that was skeptical of Christ before the resurrection. He was appointed the head of the Jerusalem church for many years after Christ's death. He was thrown from the top of the temple because he wouldn't recant. Simon the Zealot, martyred in about 74 AD. He strived to set people free from Roman oppression. After he saw with his own eyes that Christ had been resurrected, he became a zealot of the gospel. So he spread the good news of Christ's resurrection throughout Africa, even in Britain, it is claimed. And he finally verified his testimony when he was crucified by the governor in Syria. And then we have the Apostle Paul. Paul himself was a persecutor of the church, brought to repentance on his way to Damascus by appearance of the risen Christ. Ironically, Paul was heading to Damascus to arrest Christians and cart them off, some of them to their death. Paul was the greatest skeptic until he saw the truth of the resurrection. Writing to the Corinthians, defending his ministry, Paul tells of his suffering in the name of Christ. In labors more abundant, in beatings more above measure, in prison more frequent, in deaths more often. Of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1, 3 times beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I suffered shipwreck, a day and a night at sea, I've been in the deep. This is all from 2 Corinthians 11. Finally, Paul met his death at the hands of the Roman Emperor Nero when he was beheaded. So, I just would ask anyone, what could adequately explain these transformations? What could adequately explain so many men going to their death over the claim that they had first-hand knowledge regarding its veracity? People will die for a lie. We see it every day. We know that there's people that flew planes into the Twin Towers, because they believed a lie, which they believed to be true. See, they have to believe that it's true. But how many people will die for a lie that they know is false? And that is the key to this. There's not many people that will die for something that they know. And all of these people had first-hand knowledge. They knew whether what they were saying was the truth or whether it was a lie. So I'll kind of open it up to questions, discussions after that. But that's the minimalist fact approach on the resurrection. Thoughts, comments, questions? And that is faith in the resurrection, faith in Christ. Since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. And that's important. You know, we just came from the Advent season, Christmas season, where people talk about the Prince of Peace. And unfortunately, I think the world primarily views that he brings peace to men, among men, and all that. That's not what that term means. That term means specifically that he made peace between man and God, that we were enemies of God. In fact, and the evidence of that in Romans 3:23 is, or the reason for that is, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So there's this standard that is far beyond anything we can attain, but it's necessary because he's God, and we fall short of that. And as a result of that, in Romans 5:10, he says, "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life." And his life is the resurrection. The atonement is found in 2 Corinthians 5:21. "For our sake, he, God, he made him who had no sin to be sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God." So I guess, you know, from a scriptural standpoint, that is the way that I would address it. We were enemies of God,
So,
and that reconciles us.
I think that would actually pinpoint something that maybe we want to consider adding to the minimal fact is the fact that Jesus was consciously doing it as a sacrifice. He knew that he was the sacrificial lamb. He knew that he was doing it for the sin of all.
Yeah.
And I think even if you push it all the way to Mark and Luke, that seems to be something that is pretty obvious. I guess, please, I mean, other questions? I mean, we are running already out of time. So, yeah, other questions you want to?
Let me ask you guys a question, okay? What do you think of this stuff? And again, not just from the perspective, I don't want to know what you think, I know what you think. You know, no, I'm just kidding.
What do I think?
I do not want to know what you think. I mean, not just from the perspective of, oh, I'm a Christian, yay, yeah, get him! You know, not that, but from a critical perspective. What do you think of this kind of evidence that about abductive reasoning? What do you think about that? I'd be interested to get kind of some feedback from everybody and anybody here.
I think it's difficult, still difficult, even if you would come with a certified copy of the historical document, that a lot of people would still come with the arguments, look, this was changed by the early church, it was all put to place the way it should be, or the way it is now, to blind Christians to run after a God that doesn't exist. I think it's still very difficult to convey this, even if you would come with all these perfectly laid out slides and arguments.
Do you think that would be an intellectual objection, or do you think it would be that the problem is their heart?
It's an intellectual objection. They just say there really depends what they are. Whether they say there's no God or some kind of God, but we don't know. But this is my experience.
Sure.
From encountering people, especially in the scientific world.
Because my response to that then would be, okay, do you care about the truth? That's the thing I always want to find in a personal relationship with something. Do you really? Because I don't want to argue with you. You know what I mean?
They have an interesting example. I actually said this. I said there must be one truth. And he just said, look out of the window, there's the truth.
Is that true? That's what I always say when somebody tells me there is no truth. Really? Is that true?
Well, this is part of the truth.
Okay.
There's a bigger truth.
It's kind of like we were talking about logic the other day.
Well, this is the world we live in. That you can see out there.
That's kind of what we addressed last night. That there's in a modern world, there's so much skepticism built in to reason itself. People don't even believe their own reasoning, and that is a disease.
Well, if evolution is true, they have no reason to believe their own reasoning.
Exactly.
So the first thing I would want to find in that situation is, does this person really care about seeking the truth? Because again, I'm not I like argue, but I don't want to waste my time doing it. And if somebody really does want to seek the truth, then we really get into, okay, what you're saying is you think that this was changed. Okay, and we can go back, and there's more and more every day. I think you mentioned some new scriptures, but I saw Josh McDowell. Josh McDowell owns a bunch of Egyptian artifacts. We are finding today Coptic manuscripts in these death masks. Okay, and I mean, I've seen stuff in front. He brought it in front of us. Okay, Josh McDowell is an absolutely incredible individual. He's got a copy of a Torah, I think it's a Torah. Anyways, it's a scroll that he lets people touch, and the thing's worth $750,000. I think that's what it's insured for. It's worth a lot more than that, but he lets people touch it and anything. But he brought, and I think that one of the manuscripts you mentioned might have been one of them. Now these are Coptic, so they're not, but they're literally within 30, 40 years of when these documents were written. So if you really do textual analysis and you really look at there's some unique things about the way God preserved His Word. I think it's Bart Ehrman. It is Ehrman that says, if he inspired it, why couldn't He protect it? Why couldn't He? Because we don't know and all this. But when you really look at it, God did worked a tremendous wonder in the fact that how many times these things were copied. That you've got a gospel. Oh, can I copy it? Because I want to take it over to these people. Okay, and they're copying and copying, and all of that proliferation of copies proves what it originally says. And I can go through an exercise. I've got an exercise I do where we have a statement that says the farmers sold their pigs at market. Okay. And unlike what Bart Ehrman wants to say that I whisper that in your ear and you whisper it in her ear and whisper, 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 and by the time it gets to him, it's the dog went to the park in his car. You know, but that's not the way that the New Testament was transmitted. It was first of all written down, and it was written down in a spider's web. So if we took that statement, the farmers sold their pigs at the market, and if I hid that from you and I gave you 15, we could come up with 20 different statements. But if they were all derived from the one, we'd be able to clearly tell what the original said.
And still, I mean, they were so carefully copying from findings, I know that they found the same spelling mistakes in later documents, so they didn't even...
That's one of the reasons why errors are multiplied.
They kept it exactly as it was.
Yeah. And Bart Ehrman, I mean, like, if he would, I mean, out of the 12, I mean, he would easily acknowledge 9 or 10 of them. Like empty tomb, he changed his opinion. But even the minimal facts, 9 and 10 of them, he would acknowledge it. He just think that has to be hallucination and visions. And this, but then how did they know it? They just assumed that. So he didn't really have any facts behind claiming that, like, well, those are hallucinations. He just claimed them.
Going back to like the very, like, it was one of our first arguments. I wanted to say something, but like you had said that he, oh man, I'm losing it. He had said that converting to his point of view. I wrote it down. It's like converting to my point of view, what I think. So you wanted people. Let me get back to where I wanted to go. He wanted people to. Convert to his point of view rather than the truth. Does that make sense? When he was a Christian.
When he was a Christian, he wanted to convert people. Now he no longer did.
And even in him saying that, I think if he was a Christian, speaking in front of people like that, I think he would have even said with his own lips that he wanted to convert people to
his way.
To God's truth.
Right. And
now he's dismissed that, and now he wants to be more thoughtful about what people believe, and sort of, and it's really like you can see his heart in that he doesn't really believe that he's. I don't think that he really believed that he believed in God's truth, like period, like ever, and you can see it, and you can hear it in his language when he says like that. When he was a Christian, he was trying to convert people to his point of view, to my point of view, he said, about himself, what I think. And, yeah, anyway, I think that was...
Yeah, because I surely would not, I don't think that I would ever say that.
Right.
I don't know many people that would,
that
I wouldn't evangelize people to my way of thinking, no.
Right, so that they're not...
And quite frankly, if Christianity wasn't true, I'd be the first person that would want to know that.
Right.
Because I wouldn't want to believe it if it wasn't true. You know what I mean?
Marcus, in response to someone who's raising the objection that you talked about, I would agree with Joe that first find out if they actually want to know the truth or if they just want to deny everything and find good reasons for themselves to be able to think they can deny it. But if they're actually interested in the truth, the two things that I would approach them with, kind of two angles. First, I would say, well, have you ever read Plato? Or do you know of the works of Plato? Do you believe that we have fairly accurately, or do you think that was changed as well? Most people believe that we have the works of Plato more or less as Plato wrote them. However, the earliest manuscript we have of Plato is separated by many, many centuries more from the time of Plato than any of, I think, the New Testament books for the earliest manuscripts we have of them. Hundreds and hundreds of years closer to the primary source or the earliest manuscripts we have of them, and also dozens more ancient manuscripts of each of these New Testament books. We have very, very few manuscripts of any period that would be considered ancient of Plato's work.
I think the next closest ancient history, it seems to me, it might be the Iliad, but that's not really a history. But I think it's Caesar. I think Caesar's history is 1,000 years removed, and we have 10 copies.
Yeah, I saw statistics.
The New Testament is, we'll just go with the piece from John that I know is dated at latest 115. Okay, so it's within 20 years, okay, of when John was written. I'm pretty sure it's from John. Anyway, even if you go back to the event, even if you go back to the crucifixion, okay, so it's within 70 years and is the earliest. And I mean, we have hundreds from the 2nd century. We have thousands. The biggest problem for the skeptic is that there's too many copies. Not that there's too few. You know, and that goes back to the Islam issue. That, you know, one of the things the Islamic perspective is that our word is pure because it's all the same. Okay, well, that doesn't really work in their favor because in trying to think, the 3rd or 4th Caliphate, which would have been within a couple hundred years of the finishing of the Quran, he destroyed every other copy. Okay, so that's how they all got it. We don't have any idea what all those other copies say, so we have less credibility. We know that's what he thought it should say, but whether that's what it really said, compared to the New Testament, I mean, there's nothing that compares to the New Testament.
Right, I think
in modern eyes, with textual criticism, having the diverse copies, having small errors in the copies all over, and even the slight differences in the accounts of the Gospels, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah, I think there's credibility. If it was made up, they'd harmonize them.
Exactly. There is no attempt, either among the Gospels or among all the diverse manuscripts of Scripture as a whole, there is no attempt to force all of it to be one thing only, and there is no destruction of disagreeing manuscripts. If it were changed, as that person was claiming, you would see evidence of those
There'd be more harmonization. Yeah.
right.
They would have gotten rid of these problems. And they wouldn't have taken a guy from the Sanhedrin and made him the one that they put him in the tomb. Here's another very small point, but I think it's one of the strongest arguments for the veracity. And that is the fact that the women were the first people to find him in the tomb. Find the empty tomb. They would have never made that up. Never. Not to mention that they make themselves look bad. But there's times when they kind of, you know, from a certain perspective, make Jesus look bad. You know, why would you do that?
I think a lot of principles of textual criticism is precisely there's so much difficulties and parsing and disharmony in it, and it actually increases its credibility, not so much decreases it.
You know, the things like 1 angel, 2 angel at the tomb. Okay, you do need to have a plausible explanation for that. You know, I mean, because it could appear to some to be a contradiction. It clearly, from a philosophical standpoint, is not a contradiction at all. It could be viewed as contrary, okay, but it's not a contradiction because it doesn't say there was only one, there were exactly 2. You know, that would be a contradiction. But you do need to have an explanation, and I think there are reasonable explanations for all of them. But you wouldn't let that survive if you were making it up. You'd get rid of it, smooth out all the edges. Why leave the edges?
Anyone who knows anything about, you know, courtroom litigation and like proving things true or false in a courtroom by eyewitness testimony, you know that if you have like 4 eyewitnesses of an event, and say this event took place like a year ago, and you bring each one of them in one at a time and they give their account, for this to be a true event, if all of them told totally different stories, you would think that this is not something that actually happened. If all of them came in and gave verbatim the exact same account, word for word, of what they saw, you would think that they had colluded with one another and made this up. If they came in and gave an account that all told the same story, all of them included slightly different details in the way that they spoke about it and had their own way of putting it, and there were slight discrepancies, but the overall plot, as it were, was the same, you would know with, you know, fairly good certainty that this is a credible, you know, array of eyewitness accounts of a real event.
I think part of it is at a popular level. I mean, I always say people take Descartes this way. It's like I lie, therefore I don't trust everybody else. So there's like we are conscious that we are liars, so we think that everybody else lies, and which is a reasonable assumption if you think about it, and that's why we need God, forgiveness. But I think at that level, I mean, you have to look at facts, and that those are good facts in a certain way. With that, I think we'll just like wrap up tonight, and thank Joel again.